Good morning, friends. It's Saturday, and I'm back with Chapter 8 of my upcoming book, Campaign at Fort Stix. Now it's time to grab a snack, dim the lights, and let me take you into the mists of time with a story I call Scouting Mission. As I moved through the woods, I kept an ear out behind me. I was listening for the sound of either of my parents calling for me. Not that I had any intention of returning to the house until I felt sure the whole snake incident was forgotten. But if I did hear them, the tone of voice would give me a good idea of just how much trouble I might be in. I was actually surprised at Mark's reaction to the snakes because he normally liked things like that. Maybe they surprised him. Not really sure, but I would have to explore this in the future, as it could reveal a good source of fun if he was really scared of snakes. I stopped listening for my parents when I could no longer hear the compressor running in the garage, as this was a good indication I was out of earshot. When all I could hear was bird calls and the wind in the trees, I knew I was far enough away. The ground sloped steadily down away from the back of the house until I came to water. It was stagnant, with algae growing on it, and very brown. I poked a stick in it to see how deep it was, and was rewarded with a smelly cloud of black water that bubbled at me. The ground under the water was very soft and muddy, allowing my stick to penetrate a long ways. When I pulled it out, it was covered with black smelly mud. There was a swamp in the woods. Carefully walking on logs in an effort to cross it without getting wet, I made my way until I found dry ground once again, where the ground sloped up to form a small hill. When I got to the top, I could see it was actually a small island in the swamp. Looking around, I could not see dry ground in any direction except the island. On the side opposite of the way I had come, I found a rectangle of bricks and a couple of old pots and some rolls of copper tubing. It was all overgrown with weeds and covered with leaves and nearly invisible. But I knew I had found the remnants of my great-uncle Rudy's moonshine still. I poked around the old burn pit for a few minutes and, finding nothing of interest, headed deeper into the swamp. The farther away from the house I got, the harder it was to find enough logs to walk on. Several times I got my shoes wet when I had to traverse partially submerged logs. Then I came to a place where the water seemed to be clear. Watching for a while, I was able to determine there was a small stream running here, which fed the swamp as it passed through. Not far ahead, I saw the trees opening up into a very large cornfield. I walked out of the woods, looking right and left. The tree line seemed to go on forever, and before me was a forest of corn stalks. Ears were forming on the corn, but the tassels were white and yellow, indicating it was still very young. I looked around to find a suitable tree and climbed high enough to see over the corn. The corn stretched all the way to the horizon away from me. There were no houses or even trees outside of the tree line. To my right, I could see a road through the gap between the corn and the woods. The road was running diagonally toward me from there, although very far away. Recalling a map of the area, I knew this road ran north to south outside the woods to the west of the house. Since it appeared to be at an angle, that meant the tree line was angling further into the cornfield as it got closer to the road. Judging by the angle, I knew the woods were at least twice as deep in relation to the house than where I had emerged. A little more than halfway from my position to the road, there was a thin column of smoke rising from the trees. Not a lot, but enough that I knew there had to be a campfire or burn barrel there. Curious, I left the tree and headed along the trees toward the smoke. I moved very quietly, as if I were hunting. I had no idea who or what I might find ahead, and figured it was better to be cautious. An old run-down cabin stood just inside the tree line, and the smoke was coming from a chimney. Who used their fireplace in the summer? Most of the windows were boarded up with the same aged, faded-looking wood the cabin was built of, except for one large one next to the front door. The front porch was leaning down and looked as if it might collapse at any time. Next to the front door sat a rocking chair and a small table. I slowly approached the cabin and looked around. There was a variety of old broken wood furniture scattered about in the weeds, and the rusting hulk of a very old car sat at the edge of the trees not far from the cabin. If not for the smoke, I would have thought the cabin was abandoned. Obviously there was someone here, or had been here, as there was smoke from the chimney. I kept my distance, walking around the cabin at the edge of the woods, muscles tensed and ready to run at the first sign of danger. Who knew who was here? There could be a crazy old hermit for all I knew. As I came around the far side of the cabin, I saw there was a shed with a large fenced-in area. It was a chicken coop, and there were chickens all over the back area of the cabin. I watched as they scratched through the weeds looking for bugs, amazed at how they stalked and caught grasshoppers. "You just gonna gawk at them birds, or you gonna be polite and introduce yourself?" an old woman said suddenly. I jumped back startled as I looked at where the voice came from, ready to bolt at any second. There was an old woman standing next to a stump in a faded brown dress with a tattered shawl across her shoulders. In one hand she held a hatchet, poised and ready to strike, while the other hand held a chicken firmly to the stump before her. Before I could gather my wits and answer, the hatchet swung down sharply, separating the bird's head from its neck. She let go of the bird, and I watched the body attempting to fly away as it ran across the yard without its head. Blood gushed from the open neck all over the grass and weeds. "Well?" she prodded. I turned from watching the headless chicken to look at her. "Sorry, ma'am," I said. "I'm Kevin. I was just out exploring the woods behind our farm when I saw the smoke from your chimney." "Farm, eh?" she said. "That wouldn't be Rudy's place you're talking about, would it?" "Yes, ma'am," I said. "Rudy was my great-uncle, and he passed the farm on to my dad." "Oh, you're Butch's boy, then," she smiled. "Well, I'm Gracie. I knew your uncle and your dad. They used to fetch me some corn squeezins before the revenuers made Rudy stop cooking it up." I walked over and grabbed the chicken by the legs and brought it to her at the stump. Since I had learned to butcher chickens in Arizona, it was nothing new to me, but I was still fascinated every time they ran from the axe. I laid the chicken on the stump and watched as she proceeded to clean the bird. "So you live out here in the woods?" I asked. "Doesn't it get lonely out here with no one else around?" She looked around for a moment and then went back to cleaning the bird. "Well, all my family passed long ago, and I really got nowhere else to be. So I stay here with my cats and tend my chickens and garden." I looked around and spotted a small garden behind the chicken shed. It was about half the size of mine, but there were lots of big, healthy plants with vegetables. Her tomatoes were twice the size of mine, and the green peppers were nearly as large. "That's a nice garden. Your plants look all dark green and thick," I observed. "Mine aren't as big and thick as yours." "What do you feed 'em?" she asked. "Ma'am?" I asked, unsure what she meant. "What do you feed your plants? What kind of fertilizer?" She grabbed the pile of chicken innards, except for the heart, liver, and gizzard, and tossed them into the garden. "You have to feed the plants well if you want them to feed you." "I dug in a couple of bags of manure before I formed the rows and planted," I said proudly. "That will get them out of the ground," she said. "But you have to keep feeding them at least once a week, just like I did there." She pointed to the chicken innards lying in the center of the garden. "If you don't have good animal scraps like I do, you can take some manure and plant cuttings and put it in a barrel with water to make fertilizer tea. You just let that barrel ferment a few days in the sun and pour some of that tea around the plants once a week. Your plants will look like mine in no time." I watched as she finished plucking the bird, cut it up, and put the pieces in a plastic bag she took from her apron. She tossed the scraps into the garden until all that remained was a pile of feathers by the stump and the 2 chicken feet. She picked up one of the chicken feet that had been cut from the joint of the leg. "You want to see something interesting?" she asked and smiled broadly, showing me that she only had a few teeth left. "Sure," I said, wondering what she would do. She used the knife to circle around the bone of one of the chicken feet and peeled down the skin to expose the tendons. Holding the chicken foot in one hand, she pulled on the tendons to make the chicken foot scratch at me. "That's neat," I said, half laughing, as she handed me the chicken foot. "I got to get in and start cooking my supper," she said, and pointed between two trees in the woods. "You go through there and you'll find a path that leads right back to Rudy's house around the swamp." I looked at the path and turned to thank her, but she was gone. Not only that, but the other chicken foot and feathers by the stump were gone too. I looked around, but was alone except for the chickens. Going down the path, I turned to look back at the cabin one last time, but could not see it through the trees. I figured it was just because the trees were so thick, and continued on down the path. As Gracie had said, the path led around the swamp, and when the trees opened up, I was in the corner of the field looking at Fort Stix. I stuck the chicken foot in my pocket and reached into the other pocket to remove the snakes. I let them go near some of the car parts and watched as they disappeared from view. They would be there when I wanted to play with them again. The sun was still high above the trees when I looked west from Fort Stix. Mom was in the backyard hanging some clothes on the line, and Dad's truck was gone. I didn't see Mark, but I knew he had to be around somewhere. Since it was still a couple hours till dark, I decided it was too soon to go inside and walked back into the tree line near the corner where I had emerged. Following the tree line to the east, I explored the area to see what I could find. About halfway back toward the garage, I came across a thick tangle of vines and what looked to be grapes growing on them. I recognized the leaves as they were almost the same as the ones my grandmother in Lake Station had growing on a trestle between two trees in her backyard. These leaves were larger, though, and I put one in my pocket to ask my grandfather about it when I saw him. There were a few old empty beer cans at the edge of the woods, but nothing of note until I smelled the unmistakable smell of root beer. I followed the smell to a hole in the ground at the base of a tree that looked like something had been digging there. The smell was coming from the hole. I searched around a bit and found that the smell was coming from the roots of the tree. A root beer tree! I broke off a couple small roots and put them in my pocket to ask Grandpa about them as well. Continuing on, I found a very large 1-gallon glass jug with a little ring of glass for a handle near the top. There was a cork in the top, and I pulled it out to smell the inside. Wow, that was strong. Even though there was no liquid in the jug, the vapors of alcohol were very strong. I knew at once this was one of my great-uncle's moonshine jugs. I carried it out of the woods and to the back of the garage to hide it in the smokehouse. I wasn't sure what I would use it for, but it would be there when I needed it. About that time, I heard my dad's truck pull up, and I heard my grandfather talking to my mother in the backyard. Surely it should be safe to go home now, since Grandpa was there. I walked around the edge of the garden and over by my grandfather. I pulled out the leaf from the grapevines and handed it to him. "Is that a grape leaf, Grandpa?" I asked. He took the leaf from me, looked it over, and chewed on the end of the stem for a moment before handing it back. "Yep, that's a muscadine grape leaf. When those grapes are ripe, they will be big and purple. Good eating, and they do make pretty good jam." "Neat," I said, and pulled out a piece of the tree root. "I found these in the woods, too. They smell like root beer." He laughed and took the roots from me. After brushing the dirt from one, he smelled it and popped it into his mouth to chew on it. "That is a root from a sassafras tree. You can use it to make root beer." He handed the other pieces to me as we started to walk along the yard toward the house. As we came to the edge of the path to his house, he stopped and bent down to look at a large plant there. It had big, thick stalks like celery, but they were red and formed very large leaves on top. He cut one off at the ground with his pocket knife, trimmed the leaf from it, and cut off a piece to chew on. "What's that, Grandpa?" I asked, looking over at the plant. "Rhubarb," he said, eating another small piece and handing me one. "Rhubarb," he said, eating another small piece and handing me one. "It makes great pies, and I like it for a sweet and sour snack." I chewed on the rhubarb and found that it was very sweet from where it was red, but the green part was more tart than a lemon. I couldn't make up my mind whether I liked it or not. We went on into the house where my dad was sitting by the potbelly stove drinking a beer. Summer had come, but the nights were still cool, so he had a small fire going. I sat in a chair by the stove, watching the flames through the open door while they cracked open a couple of beers and began to talk. I wasn't really listening, though. I was watching the flames, amazed at the smoke going up into the chimney instead of out the door toward me. Then my mom's voice broke my reverie, putting me on edge. "Did you leave those snakes outside?" she asked. "Yeah, I put them back in the field where I caught them," I said. "You make sure and leave them outside," she continued. "I don't want to find no snakes running loose in the house." I relaxed a bit as she went back toward the kitchen. I was thinking I was in trouble for sure, but it seems the issue was not as bad as I thought. "What kind of snakes did you catch today, Kevin?" my grandfather asked, sipping his beer. "They were garter snakes," I said, smiling. "I counted 38 of them in the field today." "Just make sure and watch out for copperheads and eastern diamondbacks. They can be really aggressive." "Okay," I said, and let the matter go. I knew about snakes, as they were one of my favorite animals. "So where did you go this afternoon?" my dad asked. "I was going to have you help me in the garage, but you were gone." "I was exploring in the woods," I began. "I went out into the swamp and found Uncle Rudy's old still, and then went out to look at the cornfield on the other side of the woods." "You need to be careful out in that swamp," my dad said. "There's quicksand back there that will suck you down if you're not careful." As he said this, I thought I saw my grandpa start to smile, but he quickly covered it up by taking a drink from his beer. So I continued. "Then I saw smoke coming out of the trees toward the road, so I went to see what it was." I paused for a moment. "There was an old cabin back in the woods by the field, and I talked to a lady named Gracie there. She said she knew Uncle Rudy and you. She even called you Butch, just like Grandpa does, and knew I was your son. She said you used to take her corn squeezins before the revenuers made Rudy stop making them." Both my dad and Grandpa got a confused look on their faces and looked at each other. Dad looked at me seriously and set his beer down. "Kevin, you couldn't have talked to Miss Gracie," he paused. "She died before I left to join the army." "No, she didn't, Dad," I protested. "I watched her butcher a chicken and even grabbed the bird and put it on the stump after she cut its head off. She was cleaning the bird while she told me about how I need to feed my garden if I want it to feed me, and told me how to make fertilizer tea by putting manure and plant cuttings in a barrel with water." Grandpa sat forward on his chair and grabbed another beer. I could see he was serious, but not angry or anything. I thought I heard him muttering. "When it was time for me to head home, she pointed out a path in the woods that brought me home around the swamp and back into the field," I finished and looked at both of them. Dad finished his beer and grabbed another as Grandpa sat back. "I think you had a special experience today, Kevin," Grandpa said, smiling. "I know Miss Gracie passed away many years ago, but she was a good friend to your great uncle and I. So I think maybe she might have come back to make sure you got home safe through the woods. Best not to go over there anymore." I looked at Grandpa confused. I know I had talked to Gracie, and I could feel the chicken foot in my pocket. I thought about taking it out to show them as proof, but decided not to. How could I have talked to someone who was dead? My thoughts were interrupted as Mom came in to say dinner was ready. Dad closed the door on the potbelly stove, and I followed him and Grandpa to the dining room to eat. As I was walking down the hall behind them, I thought I heard a noise behind me and turned to look. A shadow fell in the living room beyond the door. I could see light coming from my bedroom and figured it must have been a bird or something flying past my window in the light of the setting sun. As I passed the door to the basement, I got a chill and for a moment saw my breath as if I was in a really cold room. I was about to say something to Grandpa about it when I stepped into the dining room and saw it was dark outside. Where had the shadow come from? I hope you enjoyed this look into the campaign at Fort Stix. That's all for now, but I'll be back again next week with another story. Just for you. Until then, sleep well.